Hey folks, David Stewart here. So let's go ahead and get this Writestream started. It's the Writestream to talk about writing. My initial topics for today are macro plot structures, which is the big structure of things, both in terms of novels and screenplays. And novels are quite a bit looser than what screenplays would be. And then also how you do it on the micro, how you have consistently maintain tension, how you do those micro plot points just in a scene, how you pace a scene in order to have the actual things that you want to have happen in the scene happen. So those are our initial topics for today, but of course I want to respond to questions, and that's probably the more important thing. So while people are getting in here, let me give you a little bit of an intro to macro plot structure, and I can talk about this in some more concentrated pieces of content. Macro plot structure really just is a way of arranging the events of a story in a way that separates areas of the story into different, noticeably different areas that have different effects. So typically, at the most basic level, a story will have an exposition. We'll have some sort of middle act where you add tension to the story. That is, you add uncertainty about the outcomes of the story. And then you have a final act where everything is ratcheted up to the maximum, and all of the tension in the story is finally released. Meaning, your heroes either succeed or they fail. And that can happen on a number of different stories. So that's what happens on a basic big level. And this is going to be true whether you're writing a short story or you're going to write something that's longer, or you're going to compose a single short film, or you're going to do a whole movie. You're still going to have a structure that has something at the beginning that is what people tend to call exposition, and then has some sort of middle act where things become more tense and more uncertain, and you're not sure how outcomes are going to end up panning out. Then you have a final part where the tension that's introduced at the beginning is resolved. So just as an example of a standard 3-act structure for what you see in movies, you have basically the structure. You have the first act is exposition. It introduces the conflict, the main conflict, and gets all of the characters that have to be invested in that conflict, and having to act on it. Then you have a middle act, which is the characters trying to figure out how to resolve the conflict. Then that transitions into a big midpoint, which actually isn't a midpoint. It happens about 2/3 to 3/4 of the way through a story. Each of these acts, when you watch a movie, tends to get shorter, and you can actually see this with Shakespeare as well. So Shakespeare does a 5-act structure, but you could actually interpret most Shakespeare as a 3-act structure. And each act tends to be a little bit shorter as you get to Act 4 and Act 5, and that's for a very good reason, and that's because those final acts in the third act in a movie is about releasing the tension. That's about the heroes figuring out the solutions to the problems, or not finding solutions and having their plans fail. And you can have both of those things happen, or have different things happen simultaneously. And when people think of a good plot that has big twists at the end, it's usually that something's resolved, but not in a way that's expected. And so that's something that you can build into your plot structures as well. Let's use the movie The Matrix as an example, because you guys have probably all seen The Matrix. It's a good movie. It's very technically well executed. It has a good story, and it sticks to this 3-act movie structure really well, and the story fits that structure really well. So a lot of movies that are bad try to force into this 3-act structure some story that doesn't really align with it. And that's where a lot of stories go wrong. And that's one of the problems with bad movies in Hollywood, is that there's this prescriptive idea that that every movie has to have the same format and run the same amount of time, which is like 105 minutes, and have the same points happening literally on the same pages of the screenplay, or within specific minutes. So minute number 79 is when you transition into the final act. Like I've actually seen this, like in screenwriting manuals, like, oh, by minute 79 or minute 80, you're moving into the resolution area. And it's like, okay, that's really strict. Luckily in Hollywood, that's broken down a little bit. Most of the bigger movies that you see now haven't stuck to this 3-act structure for a couple years. It's mostly the smaller ones because there's still a belief in this 3-act structure as being essential to having viewers actually understand the story. Let me quickly check chat, make sure that the stream's actually looking okay and everything, and then I'll get into what you do for those 3 acts. And you can use these in a book. The advantage of a book is that you have an unlimited amount of space to work with. You can make it as short as you want or as long, so you don't have to stick to this pacing. You don't have to stick to this format, but you could use it as a great starting point and then add in whatever you want. So I'll get to the questions in a minute. Let's talk about this 3-act structure. So the first act tends to be what's called exposition. Exposition means that you're going to introduce whatever elements the audience needs to know in order to construct all their expectations for the story. In something like science fiction or fantasy, the exposition tends to be pretty robust and take up more time than it would in, say, a romantic comedy. In a romantic comedy, you can actually shrink the exposition down minute-wise to probably half of what it would be in a science fiction movie or a fantasy movie. And likewise, if you're writing a contemporary novel set in a contemporary time period, you can have that exposition be quite quick. Sometimes you can get most of the exposition done in a couple pages if you're writing a novel, depending on how efficient you want to be. So if we look at the movie The Matrix as an example, you have an exposition that starts off with this hacker Neo trying to basically break into something, and then you have a bunch of these moments that are intended to make the viewer realize that something extraordinary is happening in front of them. So you have some of these shots with like Trinity. You have the camera go around, and you see characters doing somewhat supernatural things, and you're like, well, this is a little odd. And so that's part of the exposition as well. In this case, the exposition is not there to be done directly, but much more indirectly to give you clues for what's happening. Neo finally gets targeted by Agent Smith, and you see his mouth get shut. And that's when you know there's this crossover point, and that's kind of midway through the exposition of the Matrix, where you realize that something is profoundly not real. And I remember the first time I watched it, that at that moment when Neo is in this fluorescently lit interrogation room, that's when I realized everything was green. And I hadn't really put it together until then, because they had filmed everything in these dark clubs and in these dark rooms with these computer screens, and you didn't realize that they were coloring everything with like a green tilt shift until you got to that fluorescent room, and it was like Joe versus the volcano, where everything was like bright but not bright, and you realize things were green and things weren't right. That act ends with a choice for the protagonist, a choice for Neo. So that act ends when Morpheus literally hands him the red pill and the blue pill, and he takes the red pill. So if you're looking at this from like the hero's journey perspective, there's a call to adventure. Morpheus finds Neo, wants to get him to join him, and Neo has some doubts about it. But Agent Smith, the experience of the Agent Smith has him questioning sanity and things like that. Then you have this presentation of red pill, blue pill. Are you going to heed the call to adventure and pass the point of no return and commit to the plot and figuring out everything that's going on? Or are you going to go back asleep? Are you going to refuse the call to adventure? And so in this case, it's a very literal presentation. Are you going to do the adventure, or are you not going to? It's less obvious in other movies, but I like this one because it's obvious. That's when the first act ends and transitions into the second act, and it's a big revelation. It's one of the biggest plot points in a movie. And I went into The Matrix when I first saw it back in, I think 1999 is when it came out. I think it was the same year as Episode 1. So I went and saw it with my dad, and we were like, what, when this happened? Because we didn't have any idea what was in The Matrix, because the previews didn't give away every little thing back then. So then you have this weird sequence, and he wakes up and he's like naked and covered in goop, and there's robots everywhere, and he gets rescued. And then you have a big revelation, like, here's what the big thing is really all about. Here's what the world really is. You were asleep in this virtual world, and here's the real world. So the middle act of Matrix is all about powering Neo up and teaching him what he needs to know and figuring out whether he's the one. Then the transition into the third act happens when Morpheus is captured, and this is after they go to the Oracle. So the Oracle essentially casts some doubt. She says, "You're not the one." She basically hints that he's probably not the one, not this messianic figure. And that was actually necessary because later in the plot, Neo gets told by the Oracle that it's going to be either him or Morpheus, right? And so you set this up for the audience to know that like one of these guys is going to die. And so when all the stops are finally pulled out, Neo finally dies. So the third act is really all of this, all the stuff that happens after Morpheus is caught. They're scrambling to try to get in and do it. The tension's at the highest level that has in the movie. That's where they have the big scenes where they're like shooting everyone, and then Neo dies, and that would be like the kind of twist at the end of the third act, and then he comes back to life. And so at the end of the movie, you end up with Neo and Morpheus alive because Neo realizes that he's the one. And this happens. There's two things happening. There was this betrayal by one of the characters, I think Cyrus, and you have the robots attacking the ship and prying it apart. So the climax, the highest point of tension is right there when Neo's killed, and there's still a thread of doubt left over that like, is this really the conclusion of this part of the movie of the act? And very quickly, everything resolves. He becomes the one. He defeats everyone. He saves Morpheus. And then, bam, you end up with, like, the end of the movie and a little bit of an illusion of what could come, that there's an optimistic outlook for things. So that's how those three acts end up working. So the first act is the exposition. It's there to tell you what you need to know and expect, and it ends with a point of no return where all the characters have to commit to whatever course the plot's going on. The middle act you can think of as like a power-up act. It's where you're trying to figure out solutions to the problem. How are we going to save people from the Matrix? What do you need to know to be the hero? And then the third act is basically you're not hero. There's a big block for the characters, and they're not able to accomplish what they want. And then you have something big happen at the climax, and then it very quickly everything resolves. And that's typically the way that you construct a movie. And if you were to look at a beat sheet, you'd see some of these things happening on certain pages of the screenplay. Usually one page of screenplay is about a minute of screen time, give or take, depending on how silent the movie is, how visual it is. So one page of Star Wars would equal probably about 2 pages of another screenplay, because Star Wars is not as dialogue heavy, it's more visual heavy. Same thing with other kinds of sci-fi movies, movies like Oblivion or something like that, where there's a lot of just space. Something like Blade Runner, where there's a lot of space and just visual space happening and visual descriptions happening and less dialogue. Then a shorter screenplay can yield a longer movie. Anyway, so about page 95, 100 is when you have the big climax happen. Then the last 10 pages are all things resolving. And you could do this for a book in the same way. You can think about it in these terms. If you want to think about percentages, the first 40% is really exposition. Exposition's the longest. The middle act is usually another 30%, and then the third act could be as short as 20% of the movie. Modern movies, they tend to shrink it a little bit because that's where all the tension is, but it's usually the last 30%. So you have 40, 30, 30, and that makes up about 100% of the movie. For something like Lord of the Rings, you'd have like 50% would actually be exposition, a whole full half of the book or the movie. And then you have like 30%, 20% or 10%, depending on how short the climax third act really is. So that's an intro to macro plot structures. You don't have to stick to a 3-act structure. You can do a 5-act Shakespearean structure, which is a little bit different. You can do you can have no acts. If you're doing a short story, it's just going to be conflict, rising action, resolution, and that's how you're going to do it. And most of the time, like if you take an English class, you see plots shown as like a big pyramid, like rising action, falling action. It's like, no, it's more like a bumpy mountain and then a cliff at the end. You really want things to resolve quickly at the end. If you spend the last half of your book trying to resolve things, it's going to end up being boring for the reader. Let's answer some questions, and then I'll get back to that and talk about ABC stories maybe for a minute. All right, let's see here. Thanks for joining me on the stream, by the way. I really, really appreciate it. Let me give you a little plug. Of course, you can find my books on Amazon. You saw the ads. I also have shirts. They're probably linked down below if you want like a Zool shirt. They look like this. They're okay. I ordered some just to have shirts. People like this Muramasa cover, so I made it into a shirt. You can get it as a sweatshirt or whatever from Teespring. Looks pretty good. I did the files right, so like it's not white ink like what most people see. The white is just the shirt, and this actually looks pretty cool when you wear it. So that's my plug for that. One of the main things I like to write is xenofiction, i.e. stories from the viewpoint of extremely alien life forms, often with no human characters involved at all. I actually like that. So there's an indie series I mentioned on the channel a long time ago called Parker Interstellar Travels by Madbot McCloskey, or Michael McCloskey. Madbot's like I think a handle. I think he used to work for Google. And big portions of it are from the perspective of aliens. And he does a really good job describing the perspective of aliens and making it feel alien and interesting. In fact, it's the best part of those books by far. And whatever criticisms I might make about, this book's a little too short, these things happen a little too quickly. Science fiction is really about ideas, and he kind of nails the ideas when it comes to the xeno part of it, the alien part of it. And so I really enjoy things that are very alien. And I try to, like when I write, demi-humans in Needle Ash or Water of Awakening, I try to not make them too human or have too human a perspective, because then you're just looking at another human, right? You want somebody that thinks of things a little bit differently and acts a little bit differently than humans. So that's one of the things I like. My characters take over my story no matter what I intended. Well, that's important. The characters act out the plot. I think Stephen King would probably agree with that sentiment. The trick is to make sure that the characters and the plot you want to tell, the story you want to tell, are aligned, and that they're going to end up acting in an appropriate way. And I've actually come to this where, like, you plot a story, you plot events, and you develop characters, and you realize that the characters really wouldn't take the actions that you originally intended for them to take, which means you have to rewrite that plot a little bit. So that does happen, and that's appropriate, because you really don't want your reader to think that the characters are acting badly or acting in a way that's not appropriate for them. Characters, the more I study and the more I write and the more I talk to fans, especially of really big stuff, the more I realize that it's all about the characters. The characters are what people get really attached to. That's why they're sequels. It's because of the characters, not because of good plot execution. So one of the reasons that people really didn't like the new sequel Star Wars movies is because of the way that they treated these older characters that people really loved. When you treat a character badly, it offends you. When somebody who didn't create that character makes that character act in a way that's not appropriate for them, it becomes offensive. So as a writer, sometimes you have to think about the characters do, in a way, have their own life, and characters and readers are aware of it, and they really don't want characters to act weirdly out of the blue. And I've seen some cases writing fiction where you're like, why would this character do that? He never would have done that. That doesn't seem like him. But it's probably a plot point that the author came up with before they started writing the book, and the characters tend to develop themselves through the dialogue and how you write the book. Do you have any thoughts, advice on writing and finding a market for this and other kinds of writing with particular weird premises? Oh, back to the xenofiction thing. Yeah. Oh, super chat. $5. Thank you. Want to say great content, Dave. Do you think that stories fly in the realm of exploitation? Is getting too pervasive in attempt to become mainstream? I'm not sure which stories you mean. If you're thinking of Star Wars stories, I think that they are just, they are a little bit, they're definitely exploitive at this point. They bought the IP so that they can milk the IP, not because they love Star Wars and wanted to develop it. It's purely a business thing. And actually, I shouldn't say it's purely a business thing, because the point of a business is to make lots of money, and they're not necessarily doing that with Star Wars. They're making money, but the fan reaction eventually is going to diminish their ability to make that money, and it's already happening. Less people came out to see Solo, then came out to see Last Jedi, then came out to see Force Awakens, and you'll probably continue to see a slide as that happens. So I think the point is to just exploit the pre-existing, already built market and get as much money as you can out of it. This is why authors or people who write books, the idea is as pure as it's going to be. The best stories start as books and then move out of the realm of books. And I think one of the reasons for that is that when you option a book to make it into a movie, you're trying to not just option a good story, you're trying to option what is already there as far as a fan base. You're trying to milk more people and hopefully expand it. You hope that like the success in the literary market will signal a success in a broader market as well, but you're mainly wanting to exploit that fan base, and you'll exploit it. You'll run that milking phase until the milk runs dry. Then you'll reboot it. Then you're going to milk that again until it runs dry, until the reboots fail. Once the reboot fails, then you know that the IP's dead. And they've tried to reboot several things. They tried to reboot RoboCop. I don't think that really worked. Tried to reboot. I think they did a remake of Total Recall, which is completely unnecessary. They every so often they do these reboots, and if they fail, then that's the end of it. And if they're successful, then they continue with it. What would you do to end Star Wars Episode 9 on a series high, given the foundation given by The Last Jedi? Boy, that's a really hard one to answer. Yeah, I couldn't tell you how I'd end Episode 9 because it's in such a state of disarray at this point. What I might actually do is just have Rey join the dark side and actually like join Kylo and actually have a big struggle with them on that level. But I don't know who they'd struggle against. Like, they killed Snoke. Everybody's dead. Like, there's no conflict left in the story. So really, you probably have to write Episode 9 as just a separate story that isn't connected to the previous two movies in any way, because everybody's already dead at this point. So I might just write it from that perspective. Maybe there's a lost Jedi that comes in to train them or something. And I don't know. I don't know what I'd do with it. I'd probably try to write a really good Star Wars movie that just didn't really have a lot to do with Episode 9, because Episode 9 obliterated all of everything that was left. I don't know what I do. Maybe actually take a note from KOTOR and have them like go find some secret Force thing, and then have Kylo betray her at the end, and there'll be a lightsaber battle, and maybe they have to seal away like a cosmic power. That would be like the standard plot that I would do to try to end that. And so it would end on a note that like the galaxy's safe. And all the characters had their proper arcs. They were tempted by the dark side and resisted. And then you just can ignore like the garbage that was Episode 7 and 8. So that's probably what I would do. I'd probably have them like, go seek a secret power, and then they have to fight over it at the end. And that's like, it's like Lord of the Rings. It's basically that. I mean, it's basically a lot of things are Lord of the Rings. So that's probably what I do. Let me back up here to some other questions. Thoughts or advice on writing and finding a market for like xenofiction? It's going to be in hard sci-fi. That's the market. So you want to market it as hard sci-fi, or you want to do what Michael McCloskey does and split your story between the Xeno perspective, the alien perspective, and the human perspective, and then have it be like military sci-fi, so like Space Marines, which is a really popular genre right now. So if you want war, then you do it that way. That's how I do it. And then you could that's a built-in market right there. And you could even do it entirely from the perspective of aliens like fighting humans, and that I think would actually be pretty interesting. And that would probably hit the market pretty well too. But I don't focus that much on what the market does. I don't like try to chase the market. I just try to write stories that I like. And if there's not a market for them, there's not. That's okay. I don't live and breathe based on how many copies of a book I sell, and I'm not gonna face any kind of financial ruin if a book isn't a hit. And I've written at least one book that just never really, like, people never really paid attention to, so that's fine. Here's a comment. Matrix 1 was a masterpiece, so odd that 2 and 3 were train wrecks. I think actually if you went back and watched all 3 again, you'd end up with a different conclusion. I think actually the third Matrix movie is quite good, now that I've had some separation from it. And the second one is probably the worst of the bunch, even though the time I watched it, I thought it was like really crazy cool. I think having some separation, we went back and watched them, you'd see that Matrix 2 and 3 aren't as bad as people thought they were. They just thought Matrix was going in a different place with less semiology than where it went. But even in the first Matrix, the messianic element is there. This idea that Neo decides to sacrifice himself for Morpheus because he doesn't really believe in himself. And through that sacrifice, he gains the divine power. That was all important setups for what would happen in 2 and 3, with the third one finally having big revelations that I think a lot of people missed because they thought they were cheesy. But anyway, that's my thought. So I would give them another look because I think number 2 and 3 are actually far better than people give them credit for. My favorite comedian, Patrice O'Neill, said, "Comedy's aim is to get half the audience on the floor laughing, the other gaping mouths in horror." In his late night show appearance, The Green Room. So, great comedy points to the truth. I think Owen Benjamin says this. And if you don't watch a lot of Owen Benjamin, he's very funny, but he's also got a lot of serious stuff on YouTube too at this point. But good comedy points to the truth, and so the laughter comes from the part that points to the truth in the absurdity of reality in some cases, and the gaping on the floor comes to the fact that it also points to the truth, and it may be offensive to people. So if you make a joke about like Catholic priests molesting kids, which is really edgy, some people are going to get really upset and offended. Other people are going to end up really laughing, and both of those are because there's major abuse problems in the Catholic Church. So because of that, some people can laugh at that joke because it points to the truth, and the other people are going to be upset that it pointed to a truth that they don't like. So it depends on the reaction. Remember, like, comedy comes from absurdity, so it's an interesting thing to think about from that perspective. Yeah. Are you going to reunite for another live stream? I don't know. I learned so much with these streams. Thank you. Thank you for watching. What's the difference between exposition and expositing? The thing people say to cut down on. So here's what I think people mean when they say expositing. Expositing is saying things are like this, things are like this, things are like this. It's exploring every element of what's there in a way that isn't necessary for the plot or the viewer. So there's a couple ways that I see this. One is that, and I see this because I read so much fantasy, and because I read so much science fiction, and I watch so much science fiction and fantasy, this happens a lot. So one of the things that happens is you spend a bunch of time talking about some world-building element that you really like as an author. So you start talking about the magic system that you thought up. And you thought up a cool magic system. You think Brandon Sanderson would be very proud of you for coming up with this magic system. So you spend a bunch of time talking about it. And the reader's like, I just want to know what happens in the story. Then you're wasting pages and boring the reader. Likewise, when people sit around and have dialogue with each other, that they're saying the things that they already know, that are basic parts of their environment, it comes off as really awkward, and most people can spot it a mile away. You can see this in episode 1 in the first act, in Phantom Menace. You have this like war council on Naboo, and all these guys are sitting around telling each other what they already know. They're like, the Senate is like this. Well, this is like that. Here on Naboo, we do it this way. It's like, you guys already live and breathe this stuff. That's not what the dialogue would be like. So the more the dialogue departs from reality and is trying to tell the listener, the reader, the viewer something, the more awkward and annoying it gets. And then it becomes kind of expositing. You don't need to tell the audience every little thing about the universe. In fact, it's better to do it as indirectly as possible. Set up, you want to expose the important elements at the beginning, but after that, you want to do it indirectly usually. And even Tolkien, who's very heavy on direct exposition, will do things very indirectly after that. So you like to, if you want readers to have a great idea of what's going on, you can front load the exposition a bit. Think of like the crawl in Star Wars. Think of like the intro to Dune that's explaining the history of the universe. Those sorts of things. That gets people primed to understand what's going on, and then they figure it out from watching or from reading after that. So if a character exhibits some particular behavior, then you get an idea of how the culture that character lives in behaves. Your characters wouldn't sit around saying like, well, that in our culture we always wear a glove. All the women wear a glove on the left hand. I'm thinking of like Stormlight Archive. Stormlight Archive, you get this idea that there's one hand that is considered somehow very not okay to show people or to use in a way, a safe hand, and you get that just by having characters act with it. And he doesn't point it out. Her safe hand, which was a taboo to show to people, it's people react to seeing the hand, and then you get an idea that there's some taboo around showing the hand, just like other parts of the body might be taboo to show in modern Western society, like breasts. You can't show those in public in most cases, and how those taboos end up being worked out. So that's all, indirect stuff. So that's the difference between exposition and expositing. Are you telling things? Are you spending all your time trying to give information to the viewer, or are you spending time having the characters interact and progress a story that's good? How do you construct tension and release cycles in different genres like horror, mystery, action, romance, etc.? That's a very complicated question. I'll get to that with the second half of the stuff I want to talk about in a minute. Let me finish answering some questions. Let's see here. Oh, $5 from Scotland New. Thank you very much. Do you have an example of an outline you'd write for a book right now after realizing how characters drive the story? It'd be interesting to see. So my outlines don't look like outlines for most people. It's just an event sequence. So I don't know if I can pull one up and show you right now, but the book I'm writing right now, and hopefully I'll get it out by Christmas. If not, it'll be, early in 2019. So if you're on my mailing list, you probably got an announcement with that. When I'm finished with, with most of my writing process, then it'll go out to readers early. But I have the characters listed at the top, and basically what their role is in the fiction, and then I'll add to them. As I'm drafting, sometimes I need like just a minor static character, so I'll put one in, and then I'll put his name there, so I'll remember. Okay, this character named Data, he was this guy, and he got killed this way, and so we can reference it later. Then I just have an event sequence. They arrive in the world, they discover this happens, this happens, this happens, this happens, this happens, this happens, all the way down to the last bit. And for each of those events, it's usually a character is doing something. This character realizes that this thing is happening, and so that tends to be how I try to do it. So I think of who's populating the universe, and then I start thinking of what they're doing, and that's how I like to think about the plot. Let me see. I might be able to pull up an outline for like a book that I've already written. I think I showed the Needle Ash ones, or Water of Awakening, in another stream. It's basically that. To me, I always do a very light event sequence, and then I let myself change it if I need to as I'm drafting, because sometimes characters will, you realize that they're not going to act in the way that you kind of originally thought that they would act. You get to know them a little bit better by writing them. So that's probably the best I could do. My outlines don't look like these. Act 3 is this, Act 2 is this. They don't look like highly detailed outlines compared to other writers. It's somewhere between just writing in the dark or pants writing, and then very, very detailed. Here's the moment where there's a call to action. Here's the moment where it's like the point of no return. Some of those things can work that way. Let's see here. I apologize that this has already been covered, but what's your opinion on the hero's journey and the hero with 1,000 faces in general? So it's useful and it's a great analytical tool. The problem is when people look at analysis, here's what other people did. And then they think they must replicate that. And they must replicate it in the way that the analysis of Hero of 1,000 Faces should represent a prescription for how to write a book. And that's not the way I think you should approach it. I think you can look at those as tools. If you look at something like Star Wars, which would probably be like a hero's journey type of story, it plays pretty loose with those things and does them pretty well. So it's the execution always has a few surprises in it, and I think most of those surprises come from putting the auxiliary characters into Star Wars. The auxiliary characters really create a lot of interesting effects. I want to write forbidden romance. I don't know what that is. I think I'd need to include more setup to make it believable, but prefer the focus on maintaining and escalating the romance rather than will they, won't they. I don't write romance, so I don't know enough to give you any kind of information on that. I mean, you could probably check out an author who understands like writing romance a little bit more, but I just don't know much about it because I don't read it and I don't write it. If I write a character, it has one that is pure. If I will write a character, it has one that is a pure person, but his experiences made his personality jaded for reasons I prefer it. Okay, I don't. Basically, you'd write a coup de grace for a story if the mythos is dying, like Star Wars. Would Marvel and DC mythos face this in a different decade? Yeah, they will face it in a different decade once people kind of died out. I mean, Avengers 4 could do that. They could have done that, and that's kind of what it is. It's the end of whatever that phase, these phases of MCU that they talk about. It's kind of like the big end of that, and then they can begin with new stuff after that. So yeah, I'd probably end Star Wars 9 with just like a big conflict with Rey and Kylo. They have to work together, and then they fight over it, and then they destroy the power, and that's just kind of like the end. Maybe there's like maybe they destroy the Force somehow. I don't know. Maybe they do something that radically changes the universe in a way that we don't need to revisit it again. I don't know. Kind of like, honestly, Return of the Jedi was that way. It's like, Return of the Jedi, we killed the Emperor, things are going to be okay. Right? That's kind of the end of that. It's a big coup de grace. And that's kind of why Return of the Jedi is good. And it's good because it closes off the story. It's like, this is the end. This is everything's resolved the way it should. It's the third act. If you think of the trilogy as those three acts I talked about, it happens not just within the movie, but within the three. The first act is the intro to everything that is Star Wars. The Empire, the mega destruction, everything. The middle act would be the power-up act. It's Luke powering up, and then he faces Darth Vader at the end of Empire Strikes Back and doesn't have the power to complete it. And the third movie is about him finding a new way around the obstacle and finally resolving everything. And his way around the obstacles, rather than to defeat Darth Vader, just defeat it directly, is that he chooses like not to kill, and then it sets things in motion in an unexpected way, and it saves Darth Vader. It provokes him to be a good guy again and save his son. It's a very interesting kind of twist that happens if you didn't know that it was already happening. So if you look at Return of the Jedi as that is the final act, it really happens in the way that has to conclude a trilogy. And the only thing I would probably change with Return of the Jedi, and I can see why Lucas did this, is I wouldn't have had another Death Star. Because another Death Star, we've already had that element. This is how Lucas wanted the story to end when he wrote his original 150-page screenplay. And if you aren't a patron, I had that on Patreon. I smuggled a copy in for y'all to look at. But it ends this way. It ends with the Death Star being destroyed and Darth Vader switching sides and all kinds of things like that. So it really is pretty close, including the Ewoks. They were actually Jawas, which were monkey things in the original screenplay that Luke Skywalker taught to fly ships and blow up the Death Star. And that was how those things panned out in the original rough draft. So he wanted it to end that way. I probably would have. The technology probably didn't exist in the early 80s, but it would have been cool to end it on the Imperial planet, on Coruscant, and had that final siege that was like desperate and was bound to fail, but he kills the Emperor and manages to, essentially overturn the Empire. That would have been pretty cool. What are your thoughts on writing each character in a novel with multiple point of view characters as a short story and connecting them? I think that's a cool idea. You could. I think that could totally be done. Each person has their unique experience, and then those kind of layer together to tell a bigger story. So let's talk about a video game. Imagine you're playing Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion. They actually kind of do this. So the Thieves Guild quest chain takes you inside the White Gold Tower during the bigger events of this invasion from Oblivion. So if you just looked at each of those as a interconnecting kind of quest line, interconnecting story in Oblivion, that's kind of how it pans out. That there's like a Thieves Guild quest line that deals with it. There's, the Fighters Guild, which deals with it peripherally. The Dark Brotherhood, you're assassinating various people in the Imperial realm. If you were to do something like that as a writer, like each story is its own story, but it exposes maybe a bigger story, and then the last one uses elements from all of them. That would be a really creative and fun way to approach it. Your beard is perfectly symmetrical, and I'm jealous. I actually have a very slight hair loss right here. It's not perfectly symmetrical. I have a little bit of alopecia, and it's getting better, but I basically had a bald patch there for the last couple months. Used to have one like right here in my 20s. So they come and go. It's not perfectly symmetrical, but I appreciate that compliment. Thank you. I've heard you using these D&D alignments. Could you explain the neutral category? What are the telltale signs for deducing whether a character is true, lawful, or a chaotic neutral? Ooh, that's a great question. It's a great way of thinking about how characters think. So I like to use it, but you can use it or not use it. So with these D&D alignments, which have developed over the years, there's an intersection of three things that makes 9 total alignments. There's lawful, there's good, neutral, and evil. So a good character, they generally want to do good things. A neutral character, maybe they do good things, maybe they do bad things. They're not trying to do evil, and they don't really view good as good. They're neutral. And then you have evil characters that work for like the Dark Lord, or actually want to do evil stuff, want to destroy people, destroy the world. That's evil. Then you have 3 others that go with that, which is lawful, neutral, again, a different neutral, like neutral on the lawful scale, and then chaotic. So a lawful good character would be like a Templar Crusader. They have a rule that they live by, and that's the law. And it's a religious law, and it guides everything that they do. And they're also good. What they're doing is trying to accomplish something that's good. They're trying to defend the pilgrims on their way to the Holy Land. So a Templar is usually a lawful good character. Whereas you could have lawful evil. So lawful evil would be the assassins. Thinking of Crusades again, right? So the assassins, they're lawful evil. They have a rule that guides their actions and their ethos, but they accomplish their things through murder, like through something that violates natural law. And so there'd be lawful evil. That's a great example. And a neutral character in the middle would be, a mercenary. So a mercenary is neither, they might be lawful neutral, is that like they don't murder people. They're mercenary, but they won't kill children and women. But they don't, they'll hire themselves out to the bad guys if the bad guys pay right, don't ask them to do too many bad things. So the mercenary in the middle would be the lawful neutral. When you have neutral on laws, neutral good is one of the weirder things. That would be somebody who's kind of a loose cannon in an otherwise lawful arrangement. So you can think of like a rebel FBI agent. He doesn't do what the boss tells him to do, but he also is not completely disrespectful of the law. So he doesn't break the rules, but he doesn't follow as much the sheep. and kind of has his own way of thinking. That'd be lawful good. A true neutral character is a character that just really would be like an everyman. An everyman is a true neutral character. He could become evil. He has the potential to be persuaded to be evil. He has the potential to be persuaded to be good, to be chaotic or to be unchaotic. He can go in all of those realms. So a true neutral character would be like a Harry Potter kind of character that could just be anything, anything that's there, or even Luke Skywalker. Even though he very quickly becomes lawful good, he was intended to be a much more neutral character, as he was originally shot and originally written. On the other side, you have, neutral evil would just be your standard run-of-the-mill thief or murderer. They do evil things. They don't prescribe any law that dictates what they do, but they don't want the world to burn. True chaotic evil is somebody that wants to destroy the world, that wants to kill everybody, that wants to collapse the economy for no reason other than to cause people pain and suffering, and is unpredictable. So be like the Joker. There's a lot of those to think about. Chaotic good would be like a bard. It'd be somebody who's out to do good things but doesn't follow any rules and kind of sees that the ends can justify the means. If you have that. So the telltale signs to tell whether they're like lawful or chaotic is whether they stick to a set of rules that's dictated for them. So a chaotic good character would see that the ends justify the means. He's not stuck to any set law. Whereas a Templar is stuck to the rule. So he wouldn't violate his rule even if it meant that he would die, because that would dishonor him, and that would send him to hell, in essence, like to violate his oaths. So he never breaks the rules. Even if it would accomplish something good for him to break the rules, he won't do it. And that's the difference between lawful and chaotic. And neutral is they just don't really prescribe to a rule, but they certainly don't want chaos. And they certainly are not. They certainly think twice about breaking rules. So a neutral character would think twice about stealing something. The chaotic character would do it if he felt like it would accomplish what he wants. And the true good character would not only not steal, but he would want to punish those who do for violating ethics. So that's a good way of thinking of those differences. Let me see if there's so many questions. Let's get to another one. Do you think stories with a moral nihilistic premise can get too abusive? Rick and Morty I find as an example of this, as well as Ren and Stimpy, for trying too hard to be absurd. A little bit. So if the characters are unrelentingly don't believe in anything, any kind of good or any kind of bad, then after a while it becomes kind of exhausting to watch. I actually don't think Rick and Morty is as nihilistic as people think, and I think Rick he appears to be a nihilist. He's a nihilist on the surface, but he continually acts in ways that are not nihilistic and that violate his exterior. He continually does things that show that he actually cares about other people. He does things that care about himself. He wishes he invokes God, and then when God does what he wants, then he says, haha, there's no God, so he goes back and forth. He wants there to be something nihilistic, but he always acts against it. Ren and Stimpy is just absurdist. What I think is truly nihilistic, if you've ever watched BoJack Horseman, which is a series that I started off with me not liking it, then I kind of liked the end of the first season, and then at some point I realized I hated the show and despised it horribly. And the reason I hated it is I hate every single character on the show. I hate the way that they act, and they constantly have no idea what is morally sound. And there was a point where one of the characters has an abortion, and the other characters don't even think anything about it. They just kind of pass over any kind of thoughts about it. That I was just like, I can't watch something that has everybody just believing that nothing is worthwhile, especially BoJack, the main character. He just believes that nothing is worthwhile. The guy who sleeps on his couch, whose name I can't remember, he's asexual, right? Which is, again, asexuality is like sexual nihilism. It's like you don't even want anything from it. It's just awful. So after a while, I came to really hate BoJack Horseman, and I think it does get abusive. They kill characters off for no reason. BoJack just becomes increasingly evil as time goes on, because he cares about nothing and nobody, not even himself. and after a while, you just get tired of it. You get fatigued of watching characters that are so nihilistic. I felt the same way with House of Cards. Nobody has any kind of moral. Everybody's evil. Everybody's like neutral evil or chaotic evil or lawful evil, and that's just boring after a while. With like a couple of neutral characters that just become evil. I don't like that. I want people to actually. I want somebody that I actually would like to be successful. It's okay if characters are interesting in evil, but after a while, they're just not interesting either. Like they don't have a lot of depth to them. It's not like watching The Godfather. It's like watching some kind of imitation of it. Of course, Godfather, those guys are lawful evil. So they are okay murdering, stealing, but there's a strong code of ethics within that. So the mafia stories always have like lawful evil characters. And the lawful evil characters are often in conflict with chaotic evil characters or characters more evil than them that they have to keep in line. How well do you know your characters when you start out? Do you have a clear picture of who they are and you develop them as you go along? I actually develop them as they go along. I have a basic idea of who they are and what purpose they'll serve, but if you just put two different ideas of like characters together, like here's kind of a ditzy girl and here's a really straightforward guy, the interactions that they have develop them and kind of will reveal to you who they are, especially through the dialogue. So they develop as they go, and that's how I like to do it. And sometimes I have to go back, change a little stuff at the beginning because I didn't have the best idea of who they were. But usually I know where the story's going to go. I don't know what the characters are going to say on their way there. What about collaborations in writing, be it scripts or novels? Are these unwise to start, or have they worked out well in the past, or are they generally shunned? Some people do them well. Some people don't do them well. It just depends on your personality and who you're collaborating with and what your goals are, all those sorts of things. I generally don't collaborate. Now, I collaborate when all of my screenplays and stuff, I collaborated with another writer. But I can't imagine collaborating on a book, and I don't think I ever would. I would collaborate on a comic book because then you're dividing labor into clear spheres. You have an artist, and his mastery is creating the visual space of the comic, and then you have a writer, and his mastery is creating the dialogue and figuring out what actions are going to happen. So I would collaborate with an artist for a comic book, but I wouldn't do it for something where you're both in the same realm. You're both writing the book. I don't think I would do it like that. And plus, you have different styles. I know Stephen King has collaborated with Straub a couple of times. That just seems so hard to me. I don't think I could do it. A script is easier because even though you're in the same domain, you're just hashing out dialogue. It's 90% dialogue. And you can do that collaboratively really quick and write dialogue, or even say, you're going to write this scene, I'm going to write this scene, and come back, edit it together. And because a screenplay is so much easier to write than a novel, and because the style is less apparent in a screenplay, the way that you write prose, if you and the person you're writing with don't write prose the same way, it's hard to, maybe you could have like, this person's going to write prose and this person's going to write dialogue, but I can't imagine doing that either. So a screenplay is easier because it's a simpler thing to work with. And once you get to the more complex thing, you're already collaborating. You have a director, you have actors, you have cinematographers, makeup people, production assistants. Like there's so many people that have to collaborate to make a movie that collaborating on the writing process isn't that big a deal. And the writing is really the simplest, easiest part of a movie, in my opinion. Which asks the question, how do people mess up writing so much in movies? I don't know. I've answered it, but it's complicated. The lawful and chaotic alignments axis wasn't so much what they did, but how they did it. Yeah. Are they at heart creatures of structure and rules, or are they beings of freedom who resent authority? Yeah. And so the resentment of authority is really just like you're say that I can't steal to do something good, right? Or like it's against the law to break into somebody's house. Well, a chaotic neutral or a chaotic good bard or thief would break into the house and steal the goods that belonged to another person. So Robin Hood would be like chaotic good, whereas Sheriff of Nottingham would be, they're kind of aligned opposite. He's like lawful evil versus chaotic good. There's the conflict to kind of go across. That's a cool way of thinking of it. How does one write lighthearted and funny scenes to lighten the scene or story? Think about what makes you laugh. Think about what makes you have joy, and have a scene that has that. So if characters can smile with each other and make jokes and have something to joke about, then that's good. Think about what your friends make jokes about. Think about how you make a joke, make a lighthearted joke. Most of the jokes you make in real life are not the kind of jokes you would write, or not the kind of jokes you would take onto a stand-up stage. They're jokes that make you laugh for a moment or make you feel good in the moment, and then that moment's kind of gone. So if somebody, if somebody has to go to the bathroom in your story, they have to go pee, and they go into the toilet and there's no toilet paper. Maybe there's a joke about toilet paper. It's just a moment that kind of reveals their humanity, where people can laugh at each other, and that tends to lighten the mood a lot. And you'll find this in my books. Especially in Needle Ash, actually in Needle Ash and Water of Awakening, there's quite a bit. And most of the lighthearted stuff comes between the interaction of characters. So in Needle Ash, it's Michael and it's Sharona. And Sharona is a little bit weird. And so the tension between them often creates like lighthearted moments, funny moments where one character is kind of exasperated, but the other character doesn't realize that. And so the audience can laugh a little bit. Or a character does something that's unexpected and nice, and there's all those little developments can lighten the mood. In Water of Awakening, I had these talking ravens, and so the ravens, they're really, they're kind of like Puck from Berserk. They're mostly for assistance and kind of comic brevity, but they always have like a weird perspective, or they're willing to say something insulting to another character and not care about insulting them, and that tends to lighten the mood a little bit. It's like an insult without a consequence, and that can be funny. So it's not like two characters that like each other and are companions insulting each other and creating a rift. It's these peripheral characters that are ravens that everybody already doesn't really like, but you can't get rid of them because they can just fly with you and they won't leave you alone. So when they insult you, it's mostly just funny as a result. There's no big consequence to them being jerks. And at the same time, they can offer insight and things like that. And that helps to lighten the mood a little bit. Today's storytelling, for the most part, is soulless, just like the music. There's no clear message. Not all music today is soulless. A lot of music is great, but you don't have the time filter to filter out the garbage. And most of the music of the past wasn't that good either. I've talked at length about this. There's great art being made right now. Just because what you're presented to with like the most mainstream art is garbage, it was probably garbage in the 1960s too. Don't get too heavy on it. Find the stuff that's good and stick to that. There's a lot of great records that come out every year. Sometimes I get blown away by records as far as how good they are, how moving they are. You just have to look past the stuff that's being piped into you at Applebee's. But I don't think I've ever liked the music that was piped into me at Applebee's, so it doesn't matter to me. You got to look a little deeper. Do you think the hidden master warrior archetype can work in a realistic contemporary setting of a story? In the case of military combat veteran, what alignment they'd be considered as? So yeah, totally. And it's probably been done, but like, Rambo is kind of that, right? So like Rambo, the last Rambo movie, John Rambo, I think that's kind of the role he fills. But if you imagine you have like a battle-hardened veteran, and he's been hired to teach a mercenary band something, or to run some kind of mercenary mission, or be a part of it as like a special advisor or something. That's an opportunity to have that archetype work in the modern world. But all you really need is a strong difference between an experienced character and an inexperienced character for that to work, I think. How standalone does the first book of a series need to be? How many subplots or developments can be left open? So I don't have an easy way to answer this. If you're writing indie fiction, it doesn't have to be standalone at all. If you are traditionally publishing, or you don't know if you're going to write another book, it needs to be pretty self-contained. Keep in mind, Fellowship of the Ring is not a standalone book at all. So you have a long history of series with their first books not being standalone. Compare this to Harry Potter, where each book has a definitive close to the plot. and you can make a decision from there. So if you don't know if you're going to write more of the series or it's like traditionally published, it needs to be pretty standalone. I'm personally a fan of standalone works, works that can kind of stand on their own, even in a series, because I like to feel that when I close a book, I'm done with something and I'm satisfied. I get fatigued if I'm reading a series and there's been no meaningful conclusion of plot after a couple of books. I get fatigued and I want to put the series down, because to me that says that the author is just stringing you along and doesn't really intend to end it. It's like watching a bunch of episodes of Dragon Ball Z. There's like 3 episodes in a row of characters talking and powering up, and you're like, when is something going to happen? Or some of those middle books in like Wheel of Time, they don't stand well on their own, and there's a reason for that. So you have to make that decision on whether you want to. If you're going to go the indie fiction route, yeah, you can just end on a cliffhanger, and sometimes it's advisable to end on a cliffhanger, but sooner or later you need to give the people what they want, which is a big time resolution. So I guess that's my advice on that. I find that characters are a lot more complicated than simple alignment. Obviously, yeah, totally. I use alignment to hash out what the character's conscience would prick them for doing and have them compromise. Yeah. So that's a great one, right? And characters grow. They're not static. So Han Solo starts off as a somewhat evil neutral character. He's a smuggler. He's really a bad guy, and he gets seduced into being a good guy. He goes along for the ride, and then as you get into the third act of Star Wars, he's like, I need to leave. I got debts to pay. I'm not in this. I need to care about myself. I'm a neutral character. And then he comes back and saves Luke, and that's a big signal that he's done growth into like the good category. So characters don't remain static. They change over time. And it's really important to allow them to change over time a little bit and not leave them in one little area. Otherwise, the reader gets bored, or the viewer will get bored with them. Mechanically speaking, how do you control pacing in a story? If I wanted to write something like Stephen King's Running Man, how would you do that? So you want to have some kind of... So this will get to the second thing that I wanted to talk about in the stream, which is pacing and doing plot on the micro level. So head over to my website, dvspress.com, and you're going to see a short story there called... in fact, it's a short. It's like flash fiction almost. A little bit longer than flash fiction. It's a scene, really. It's an aphorism, and it's called Lined Paper. And in it, there's both an explanation for how I executed that particular scene and the scene itself. So you can read it, and then you can have my very ordered explanation of how I paced it. Generally speaking, I think if you can have something happen every page or every other page, you are going to be doing a good job pacing. If you have multiple things happen on a page, sometimes that's not enough time for a reader to react. But the bigger danger is putting too many pages of things not happening before you get to something significant. And I'm aware of this as I'm writing. In the drafting process, I'm always writing. I'm like, I'm having too much. There's too much rest here. Something needs to happen. So you want some moments of tension to punctuate your rest. If you have your characters escape from danger, then there needs to be something that happens after that, after they react to it, that keeps the story moving. Like they escape from the danger, but they realize they left their food behind. Oh my gosh, how are we going to get the food? Thus begins the next little conflict. Oh, we found some nuts. Oh, but they made Timmy's tummy hurt. Now he has diarrhea and the monster's coming, right? Then you're writing a bunch of little pacing things that happen. It's way better, in my opinion, it's way better to pace something quickly than to pace it slow. If you pace something quickly, the worst somebody can say is like that, I wish he had spent more time developing, I don't know, having the characters talk, which most people aren't going to complain, but they are going to complain if it's boring. And more than that, if a book's boring, a reader's just going to close it, and that's the end of it. And that's the worst thing that can happen. You never want the reader to close the book before you're finished telling him the story. Even if he gets to the end of the story and doesn't like it that much, at least it was good enough for him to finish the book. Not finishing the book's probably like the worst thing. I already intend to make a series, but I will likely publish it traditionally. I have elements that foreshadow things that become important in later books, but should they be included in book one? If you can include them in a subtle way, totally. There's allusions in the first Harry Potter book that have consequences in later books. Same thing for like pretty much every series. There's things that have consequences. If you want an example of each one, go look at the Earthsea series, which in my opinion is better than Harry Potter. And really, what Harry Potter did is take the Mage College idea from the first Earthsea book and just bring it into a more urban setting, and have a little chosen one kind of big arc from that. But go read those. In each book, there's a big time span between each book, so each book's very self-contained. If you want to look at something that's really self-contained, but each of them has elements that come into play and are important in following works. Unfortunately, I don't think the series ends quite as strong as it begins, but it definitely is a great series to check out. It shouldn't be forgotten at this point, but it's pretty good. So anyway, going back to pacing, you can check that scene out and see exactly what I did. Basically, it's some people in an office. They run into each other. They drop their stuff. Then there's a bunch of little hints as to what their relationship is. There's tension because this guy's late to a meeting. He realizes he left something, and then finally you get revealed what it is. And so at the end, it ends with a big revelation. Not really a release of tension, but like a more just realization of what's actually going on. So that's something that I did with that scene. You can check it out on your own time. What do you think about the scene sequel structure of writing? I don't know what that means, so I can't answer that question. Hey, David, any suggestions on how to write a good action scene? That's really technical and difficult to explain briefly. But you want to explain the action in a way that the reader doesn't have to read it twice, is my rule of thumb. So for action scenes, florid prose is not that good. It's better to say, you'd be better off with shorter sentences that describe exactly what happened. And compound sentences that actually are very clear. So if it's like Michael swung his sword in a wide sweeping arc at Jonathan's head, Jonathan raised the dagger of his left hand and nimbly turned away the sword, and then thrust with his rapier, but Michael was too quick, and the rapier slid past his ribs on his left side, and Michael used the opportunity to slash at Jonathan's legs. He caught Jonathan's boot, and it gripped, but it didn't penetrate the leather, right? So you gripped the boot, but did not penetrate the leather. With a kick, Jonathan pushed away Michael's blade and thrust again with his rapier, right? So that'd be, I'm describing a sword duel. And you're describing exactly what happens. Now you're using a little bit of colorful language. It slid past his ribs. He turned it away deftly. You could say it caught on the crossguard, and he used the leverage to push the sword off to his left, where it landed in the dirt. Those are really specific, and so when somebody's reading a scene, it's like they can see it, and boom, 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 this happens. People tend to speed up their reading when they get to action scenes because they want the tension is there, and they want to release the tension. So because people are reading faster, you don't want to slow them down by having complicated sentences happen. You leave the complicated sentences for when you're describing beautiful people or beautiful things, wide marble halls or whatever. So leave the hoop-de-doodle for a different place. When it comes to action, speak simply and directly, and let the reader know what's happening so that they can release the tension in a timely manner, or that you can string them along and have that continue to happen. How would you go about weaving religious philosophy and theology into a story? Does it have to be planned out and established beforehand, or can you plant the seeds in there as you go along as well? So it depends. Like, so if characters have a philosophy, if we have a Templar, he has a rule he lives by, he's a Christian, all that stuff's explicit, and he's just going to act in a way that's appropriate to that and expose his beliefs through what he does. If you're talking about like some larger philosophy of like virtue ethics, right? Like, how do you write a story that involves virtue ethics? Well, you have the characters act out what the philosophy commands them to do. So if you have a character that's like a libertarian and believes in the non-aggression principle, well, then he'd see somebody doing something he doesn't like using drugs, and he wouldn't do anything about it, right? Because he would view that that's not, that's a violation of his ethics. So you'd have the characters act in those ways. So if you look at something like Atlas Shrugged is all about the philosophy of Ayn Rand. And it's all about characters talking about it and acting out what she believed was the correct kind of ethics that she called objectivism. So the characters are acting in the way, and the evil characters are acting in the way that's against the philosophy. So you could do the same thing if you wanted to write a book that was all about Thomas Aquinas's virtue ethics, right? You'd have characters that explicitly violate those virtue ethics and are villains, and then you'd have the protagonists explicitly adhere to them or implicitly adhere to them, meaning they do them, right? So they act charitably. Thomas Aquinas thought that charity was like the only thing that could really come from God, because God treated man charitably. So a character that acts very charitably and according to that, he's going to do it through his actions. And the character that's not charitably is going to do it falsely, right? He's going to do charity that makes him look good. And the reader is going to pick up on that dichotomy and start to dislike the antagonist, because maybe the antagonist has like a false sense of charity and he's fake, and that people get turned off from that. Whereas the protagonist acts with virtue, and he may be very virtuous in terms of his charity, but have other flaws, like he drinks too much, or he's got some other kind of mortal sin that's affecting him that he has to deal with. But because we see him acting out some part of that and struggling in the conflict with some other part of virtue ethics, then you're essentially creating a story that's centered around Thomas Aquinas's virtue ethics ideas, right? So you can look at it like that. So it's all about exposing it indirectly. I mentioned Ayn Rand. Ayn Rand, she does it very directly. She'll have John Galt have a long speech that explains her ethics. And these are very quotable things, but they don't fit a story that well. And so I would actually personally avoid those. I would personally avoid this. Now, in my Eternal Dream books, like Needle Ash and Water of Awakening, I have I essentially have some Platonic ideas in them. So the magic's based on what might be considered Platonic Gnosticism, but I'm not a Gnostic, and the characters are not really Gnostics either. But the relationship between the creation of things from concepts and a world that's static based on those concepts has a lot to do with the magic system. And so that's exposed through the characters' explorations of magic, the Fae, and their world in general. So I try to do it indirectly, and especially with something that is kind of as subtle as, concept realm kind of stuff. You don't want to stop and take a whole lot of time to explain it. Although there is a scene in Water of Awakening where I do have one character explain magic a little bit to the other, because it's just really hard to do things indirectly. It's really hard to have 100% indirect exposition without any character kind of saying how things are. And so I did have a little bit of what might be called expositing, but I felt it was necessary to set up what happened later in the story. So sometimes you do things like that. Can you give examples of creating tension in different genres? So horror, the best horror tension is the unknown. It's all about giving very few details, but details that are rather striking and will make a person feel uneasy. Uneasiness is the best kind of tension in horror. So if you have a character, like maybe a character he's at a carnival, and there's something wrong with one of the carnies that's there, and he can't put his finger on it, but the carny has like some sort of smile that he interprets to be evil. And we just have some interactions with there, and maybe the character sees it a couple times. The carny's behind different stalls, and the carnival's dark, and the music is starting to change, right? All of these things create a sense of uneasiness with the reader. And what the reader's really doing is imagining all the possibilities that are bad. And that's what you want to do with horror. Now, there's a different kind of horror, which is like gore horror. which you're just describing gore, that's different. That doesn't create tension, right? That just creates grossness. And it's okay to gross readers out from time to time, to shock them and show them something gross. Like, I've done it. Like there's a part in Water of Awakening where the characters or one of the characters encounters like this bloated corpse, right? Corpses are gross, and if corpses have been sitting out for a while, they're gross. Now, I don't describe in too sickening a detail everything about it, but it's gross, right? And you want the character's grossed out by it. You want the reader to be grossed out by it. But in horror, the main feeling is fear, not disgust. So you really want to use a couple details that are dropped in and re-emphasized to make the character, or not make the reader, imagine something that's really, really bad. You can see this in movies. Alien's a great example. You never see the entire Alien until the end of Alien. And when we do see the entire Alien at the end of Alien, it's not nearly as scary as seeing parts of the alien beforehand, because we could imagine some horrifically grotesque creature. And even when you see the alien, it's in darkness, high contrast darkness, that makes it difficult to figure out the details of what the alien actually looks like. And then they also hired, oh my gosh, the name of the artist that created the alien is slipping from my mind. He does all the Triptykon album covers too, or did them when he was alive. But he created something that was so full of grotesque detail that it's hard to get a clear picture of what it actually looks like. So that helps as well. Clear pictures and very defined threats are not the best for horror. You want undefined threats that can scale up to infinity in the minds of the reader. That's how you create tension in that. Other kinds of other genres, like an action genre, it's mainly plot driven tension. Like, is this going to succeed or fail? Is this guy going to pull the trigger when he's got the gun on me? That's where the tension tends to come from, rather than from an execution that's as subtle as good horror. In romantic comedy, the tension, again, mostly comes from the plot. An awkwardness between the characters, an inability for them to get together, misunderstandings, those all create tension. And those all come from the plots. David, would you happen to know what makes people like Stranger Things so much? I've seen both seasons and things drag for too long, just as you said before, not to mention the several plot holes. I haven't watched Stranger Things. I think I watched the first episode, but didn't watch more than that because I just didn't find it very interesting. And I don't really like series. They're not really for me. They drag on too long, especially if they have one arc. Now, Star Trek I love, old Star Trek, because each episode was an episode, and you didn't really get a whole lot of connected arcs until like the last 12 episodes of Deep Space Nine, which ended that Next Generation era like kind of perfectly. And otherwise, they don't connect as much, and that's what I like. I don't like if it's an hour. There's a lot of story you can tell in an hour, or you can have a 2-part episode, 2 hours. There's a lot of story you can tell in 2 hours. But an entire season of 1-hour dramas that are all intimately connected to each other, after a while, it just becomes like character melodrama, and I get bored of that, and things stop kind of moving forward. And that's not to say it's not okay for you guys to like that. You can like those kinds of things. You can like long series. It's just one of the things that doesn't really interest me as a very time limited person. Can you give suggestions on how to slowly make a character slowly become dark? Yeah. So think of the darkness in your own heart, because everybody is a sinner. Everybody has temptations. Small temptations often lead to bigger betrayals. And so a character can slowly become dark by a series of decisions that take him deeper into it. The Godfather is a very good example. So with The Godfather, you have a character, you have Michael Corleone, who's a good guy at the beginning. He's a good guy. He's been raised by guys who were not good. They're lawful evil. And over time, he becomes more and more fully involved in the evil aspects of it. You can't mess around with it. So each time he touches sin, he goes deeper and deeper and deeper into it until he becomes very hardened by it at the end of the movie and is truly the Don. He's the hardened, lawful evil mob boss. So he makes decisions to. The big decision is he made a decision to assassinate a police officer. Now, that police officer was a bad guy, and the police officer, not just an opponent in the story. The police officer was legitimately an evil character. But that began the process. Then he had to go escape, and he had to go escape and be fully involved in this mafia scene in Sicily. And then he got married in Sicily, and you think he's going back out, but his wife is killed. Is killed as part of a vendetta against him, and so he becomes hardened again, and he comes back, and he's harder and harder and harder, and then all the way till you get like in the second movie where he kills his own brother. He has his own brother killed because his brother is not going to serve the family and serve him correctly. He becomes fully done with the evil, and his wife even reflects it at the end. She's like, I aborted a baby because I can't stand to have your children, because you become so evil. So the first two Godfather movies are great to look at that. And the third one, a little bit of him coming back, though people tend to not like Godfather 3. And I don't really like it that much, but it's an attempt to see that character try to redeem himself. Another one. What are your opinions on using tone shift effectively? Let's say I wanted to do a series that starts out lighthearted but gets progressively darker. I don't know. I couldn't tell you like how to do that. My guess would be, the plots get darker. Something like, the Chronicles of Prydain starts off kind of lighthearted and gets darker. I mean, Harry Potter starts off pretty light and gets darker and darker as things go. Things will tend to get darker as conflict escalates, because the characters have to make harder choices. They have to do rougher things. They're in tougher circumstances. They're more exposed to evil. So as the series goes on, things will usually get darker. Lord of the Rings, things got very dark as things went on. Wheel of Time, things got extremely dark as they went on. The Wheel of Time did not start necessarily lighthearted. So I don't know. As conflict escalates, things tend to get darker, and that's the best that I can say. H.R. Geiger, yes, Geiger is the guy who did that. He did all those cool Triptychon covers too. So that's where I figured out who he was. Is I'm like, these are the aliens, and they're on this metal band cover. Cool. Oh, it's by this guy H.R. Geiger. He actually got like stopped at an airport because his images were so grotesque. They thought that they might be some kind of bizarre porn or something. Very interesting arc. Okay, so I've covered both the big things: macro plot structures, the micro. I've linked to the micro. What I did in the micro is every so often you have something that creates tension. There's something that the character has to do to resolve some tension. And so if you look at that scene, the big tension that happens is he realizes that this girl he bumped into has some really important paper, and he has to go get it back. And then at the final resolution, you realize what that paper was. And that's how it resolves. So those are the big things that I want to cover in this stream, and I've answered all the questions that I can answer so far that I feel like I can effectively answer. Let me communicate one more thing before I go, because it's been an hour and a half and I need to kill the stream. A lot of times this 3-act structure has to do with what's called an ABC story. The ABC story, as you see it in movies and in sitcoms and everything else, that's a main plot and then several subplots. Usually you have the main plot is exposed in the first act, and then you have the beginning of a B story, a subplot. And then you have the third act has a C story that helps resolve the A and B stories and bring them together. Another little plot. So if we go back and talk about the Matrix, take it all back to the Matrix. The Matrix, the A story is Neo being the one and being the one who can overcome and conquer the machines. By the time he's freed from the Matrix, you have the beginning of the B story, which is a romance between him and between Trinity. And that's a strong B story. In fact, most B stories tend to be romances. I shouldn't say most. They're frequently romances. They're more frequently romances than anything else. Then the C story is this betrayal that happens by one of the people that's in Morpheus's crew. I think it's Cyrus. So he betrays them, And that's where the C story begins. And so the C story is he betrays them, and Morpheus is captured, and they have to get Morpheus out. Now, the A story of is Neo the One is still percolating there, but now they have to solve this more pressing C story, which ends up resolving the A story and proving that Neo's the One and all these sorts of things. So the C story of Morpheus being captured through this betrayal ends up providing all the little missing pieces to finally resolve the A story and the B story, because I think the big climax is like the squid machines are coming down to eat them or whatever with their laser beaks. And Trinity says, I know you're the One, Neo, and you can't be dead because I love you. And the Oracle said that I would love the One. And that like brings him, he's on the edge of death, and it like brings him back, and then has all the divine powers. So the A, B, and C stories all lined up to resolve the question of whether Neo was the One. Then he quickly clears out all the bad guys and saves Morpheus, and they all get out and all that, and he does all the amazing stuff, stops the bullets. Like that's how it resolves. So that's how you see the ABC story relate to that 3-act plot structure. Maybe I should have said that like when I was talking about it, but I wanted to get to questions so bad that I thought I'd leave that for something else. Maybe I'll make a separate long form video that talks about how those things relate. So that's how you tend to see them. Let me answer final questions, and then I'll give you plugs and say bye. Would a villain destroying a city in the sequel betray the buildup and climax of the first story where the heroes are trying to protect it? Absolutely not. No, that'd be great, because it's a big kick in the where. It's like Darth Vader defeating Luke at the end of Empire Strikes Back. No, it's perfect if you're going to have a third one where something else important happens. So if they protect the city in the first one, and the second one they fail, that's a very important step for the larger arc, the growth, because now the characters have to they're really on the defensive, and they have to realign what they're doing and figure out how they're going to proceed from there, and how they're going to actually overcome something that turns out to be more powerful than they are. That's a great second volume ending, is to have them fail. Thank you, Scott. Thank you for the $5. I really appreciate that. I think of Return of the Jedi and TFA with that. Yeah. So I think Return of the Jedi is great. Force Awakens, not as much. It's all about execution, though, and how those things fit in context. Ever read and watched the film adaptation Watership Down? I have not seen the film adaptation, but I read the book a long time ago. It's another good story for kids, drawing experience of World War I. Yeah. So that's a good one. I like Watership Down, and I like it for kids. I think it's a good book to read for kids. Maybe one of these times I'll have like some book recommendations for cool stories to read to kids that are actually good and that they like, rather than most of the garbage that they end up being forced to read, or in some of the pop garbage, that is kind of trying to play on the Harry Potter hype train and do stuff like that. A lot more classic literature that the kids can have big connections with. Watership Down's a cool one. So are like the what were they called? I'll make a separate video about those. What if the destruction happens early on, perhaps is even the inciting incident of the second volume? I think that's good too, because then it puts them on the defensive. They have to figure out how to react and deal with that. So yeah, it can totally be an inciting incident that happens about 15 or even 30% into the first book. It's like the big shock that happens that can totally really set off the second volume, ups the tension, especially if you have a good resolution at the end of the first book. People are wanting the characters to come back, but they want them to do something important. So you got to put them on the defensive on that second volume, and really put them in a place where they are in danger again, where they're in a lot of danger. So that's kind of how I feel about that. So I think those are great ideas. All right, thanks so much for watching. Don't forget, if you are interested in reading my novels, you don't have to be interested in reading them, of course, but they're around. Muramasa Blood Drinker. Here's the old cover. I think I might make this the cover again, because it's a little more striking on Amazon. I have that made into a shirt, which you can buy. Hopefully that's linked down below, Teespring. My little store here. So, the shirt looks like this. It has the cover. I took the care to design some of these shirts so that they are actually cool. Here's what the current cover looks like. Water of Awakening, which is a high fantasy novel. It's really the first in the series of what I call the Eternal Dream. Needle Ash, which is a little 3-book series. I'm going to be putting this out as a 1-volume book a little bit later on, but right now you can get the first one for free on Amazon. So I'll be doing another little edition of these, clearing up some of the typos that have reappeared over various versions of this on like it's on like 20 different sites, so it's kind of complicated to keep up with versions. But so this you can get that first one for free, and I think you actually get the second one for free if you're on my mailing list. So you get those 2 for free, and I'll probably give the third one out on my mailing list pretty soon as well. Those will come out as 1 volume, and that's really part 2 of the Eternal Dream series, and that's probably how I'll operate that series going forward. The 3rd volume hopefully will come in 2019. I already have the story worked out, and it's again a more self-contained story with a little bit different characters than happens. So the first each large story in the series focuses on a different set of characters that are slowly moving towards what's eventually going to be the conclusion of the series. So it'll take a little while to get there, but I like each book to have a great story on its own. That's what I like to do. So thanks so much for watching, and I really appreciate you guys giving me all the questions and trying my knowledge and making me have to think about a lot of this stuff. So I'll see you guys next time, and have a great one.